Hi, I'm Ben Smith from Politico, here in the Brooklyn Bureau of Politico, talking to the Washington Examiner's Byron York. I'm just back from following Rick Perry around Iowa a bit, and Byron is still shedding the celebrity status he acquired, hosting the what turned out to be a very interesting and important debate on last Thursday in Iowa. Hi, Byron.
Hi, Ben. How soon it fades. Soon it fades. I'm Byron York with the Washington Examiner. We're going to be talking about a number of political stories, beginning with what I think is clearly the hottest story of the moment. It's on Ann Althouse's blog, and the headline is Politico's Ben Smith has trouble getting his mind around Rick Perry's manliness. And I read it, and I thought it was really quite a damning indictment of your journalism.
Trenchant, really.
Yeah. Well, so what do you make of it? So you're following Rick Perry at the Iowa State Fair, right? And for some reason, you ask Rick Perry whether he's packing. Is that how it goes?
You know, I'd actually just asked his staff whether he was armed, because he tells stories that often involve his care. You know, he's out for a run and he sees a coyote and he shoots it. It's a favorite genre of Rick Perry's story. Mm-hmm. And his campaign has been launched amid this sort of atmosphere of hyper macho communications. There's this great jokey but also supportive Twitter feed, Rick Perry Facts. So anyway, half in jest, I asked a couple of his staffers if he was carrying a gun at the state fair that day, and they didn't know. So I figured I'd ask him, and he gave me a fantastic answer. He kind of put his arm around me and said, "Well, you know, I make a point of never commenting on whether I'm carrying a handgun, and that's why they call it concealed." It turned out, actually, it was against the rules to carry a handgun at the Iowa State Fair, and I don't actually have any particular reason to think he was, but then it would have been concealed.
So you do not believe he was armed when you spoke to him? I
don't know, but I don't have any reason to believe he was.
All right.
And I do wonder, and I wonder what you think about this, Byron. I was thinking about it just this morning. If you polled Americans and said, you know, Rick Perry often carries a handgun, does that make you more or less likely to vote for him? What would the answer be?
My guess is it wouldn't hurt him at all.
Certainly not in a Republican primary, right?
Certainly not the primaries, but not in a lot of the world as well. You know, I do think, and this is very odd, but I started us down this road, I guess. There's this odd little subgenre of stories now among in the press about Perry's manliness, and there's a story on the Atlantic website right now called "Rick Perry, Manly Man," and Garance Francaruta writes. Oh, well, here it is. The lead sentence is, Paul Begala reports that Texas Governor Rick Perry wore such tight jeans and, quote, adjusted himself so often, end quote, as a young Democrat in the Texas state legislature that Begala and a group of other aides called him crotch. And she finds that a, quote, interesting data point. And I do wonder whether there's some odd thing going on that reporters are having a hard time figuring out this guy who, you know, walks around, may or may not be carrying a handgun, and, isn't, what can I say, isn't listening to Lady Gaga all the time or something.
I mean, I don't think reporters are, he's a politician with, like many politicians, a practice shtick, and his shtick is this stuff. I mean, it wasn't like, it was, as with all politicians, to some degree, performance and to some degree, kind of self-deprecate, self-aware performance. But, I think his supporters kind of love it. It's how he's introducing himself. I mean, I wonder if there's, and I think what I was trying to get at and got beat up a bit on the blogs about, perhaps it was the sense that, that you can take the cowboy shtick too far when he's talking about, whether Ben Bernanke committed treason and, who things would get ugly if he came to Texas.
Right.
I mean, I don't know, but I guess I think that, a lot of Republican-based primary voters may think that's great and think all of it is kind of just is great. But swing voters in general elections tend to be suburban women, and that may not be kind of the ideal pitch.
Yeah, I did say a number of times before he got in that once again gets in and starts running, he may not prove to be everybody's cup of tea. And I think that is.
I mean, there was a region that George Bush, and well, like Rick Perry is the guy. If you like ask somebody who hated George Bush, like a liberal who hated George Bush, like what's George Bush like, they would describe Rick Perry for you.
That's right.
He's the guy Bush like pretended to be, essentially.
Right. Rick Perry is all Texas. Bush was New England and Texas, and Rick Perry is all Texas.
And Rick Perry, there was a reason that strategically that George Bush took on this overlay of compassionate conservatism.
Which was to get elected.
There was a sense that like pure Texan conservatism was a harder sell. Mm-hmm. And Perry has not tried to acquire that sort of half step to the left.
Now, were you at the dinner in Waterloo, or as Michelle Bachmann says, Waterloo, the other night? Okay, now there have been a lot of comparisons drawn between her performance and his performance, basically giving him the advantage. That's what you think too, right?
Oh, yeah, it was really one of the most, really kind of, often when you don't see two politicians together on a stage, it's harder to compare them. It was one of the most sort of stunning contrasts, just between the kind of raw skills and ability, and both the raw skills and practiced experience of two candidates that I've really ever seen. I mean, he just, as we wrote in our story, he just kind of schooled her. He came in early, he met everyone, he shook every hand, he patiently sat through Michelle Bachmann's speech and respectfully applauding, and just kind of handled the situation with a great deal of command. And calm, and there were swarms of reporters, and he happily engaged them, but also was able to have them dissipate without anybody getting elbowed in the stomach, which is sort of the Michelle Bachmann's entourage's routine. And she came in like a celebrity and jumped on stage waving and blowing kisses to a room of a couple hundred people who she could have just shaken all their hands.
Yeah,
and didn't leave the stage until she was swept out again with her entourage. And then a very curious thing, when we asked her why she was late, or a reporter asked her why she was late, she said she'd had a family reunion that day.
Right.
And my colleague, then Emily Schultheis, yesterday called members of her family, and they said, oh yeah, we did have this reunion, but she didn't go. So it's a bit of a mystery, actually, where she was that day. And,
Well, I think that is, I was interested when I saw what you wrote. I had gone to see her just before the debate, gone to see her in Atlantic, Iowa, in western Iowa, and it was a very standard stop, maybe 45, 50 people there for kind of a mini town hall where she speaks for a while and then hands the mic out and for questions. And then so she does that, and it's all fine. And then the staffer says, okay, we got time for one more question. And the mic goes to a retired fellow sitting down who has not come to ask a question. He's come to complain, and he says, I just wanted to tell you that last week I got 5 automatic phone calls from your campaign, and I think there's a law against that in Iowa, and do you have some sort of exception, and I'm not happy about this. So this has the potential to, end the event on a real bummer. And she walks over, and she's a little taken aback. And at first she says, well, I'm sure we're obeying all the laws. And a staffer says, well, we'll be happy to take your name off the list. And she says, but I'm so glad you've asked this question and that you've come. And she goes over and shakes his hand. She's standing, and he's sitting in the chair. And then she holds his hand. She doesn't let it go. And then she starts talking about, I really, really, really hope you'll be able to support me at the straw poll, and this is what I believe. And she's 100% pro-life, and she's Second Amendment and all this stuff. And she devotes a lot of time to this guy, eye to eye, deep into his eyes, holding his hand, looking at him. And I talked to him at the end of this. It was kind of like this Bill Clinton thing where there's one guy in the room who doesn't like you, and you work on him the whole time. And he told me at the end that he thought he would go to the straw poll and that he would vote for Bachmann. And
that's pretty impressive.
So it was so I concluded from this one tiny little bit that, she is actually pretty good at this one-on-one stuff. So it was completely different. If she does do this rock star sort of sitting in her bus until the last second before she's introduced and then popping out into the spotlight and then leaving again, that's clearly the wrong way to do it. In Iowa, and she showed a lot of ability to do it the right way. So I'm not quite sure what's going on with her.
No, I agree. I mean, it's sort of hard to figure out, and her campaign just sort of won't talk about it, so which doesn't make it any easier. I mean, and clearly, and she's really connected with and tapped in a lot of people and tapped into something real in Iowa, and her win in the straw poll was real, and so. I mean, I wouldn't, count her out, but seeing the two of them together, I mean, Perry's been doing this for basically 20 years, and Bachmann, aside from, has been running for president for 5 or 6 weeks. Perry's been, a statewide candidate in a big state for a long time, and it's just sort of a different set of skills to some degree, and he's, particularly in Iowa, I think even a bit less so in the other early states, it's a skill set that he's really got.
Yeah, and also he obviously seemed to suffer not at all from this talk, some of it from me, that he had really kind of dissed Iowa on Saturday by announcing in South Carolina on the same day as the straw poll. That seems to have affected him in zero way, wouldn't you say?
Well, no, I think actually probably, and I talked to folks at the straw poll who were kind of irritated about it. Mm-hmm. And I think they'll probably, I mean, I imagine it cost him something. I mean, just because the straw poll, that's a real, straw polls are usually meaningless because they're a meaningless, unrepresentative sample. If you got 17,000 people showing up, when you're talking about a caucus that's only going to draw somewhere else like 124,000 last time, it's a high percentage of the actual, electorate you're dealing with there. So no, right. I think he missed an opportunity.
Right. This is way beyond just like a CPAC straw poll or something like that. So anyway, now he's kind of set himself up to be in Iowa when Obama was in Iowa, and having it almost to himself because I think Bachmann's in South Carolina and Romney is in New Hampshire. So Perry is there when the president is there, kind of man to man, toe to toe, face to face. Not really, but that's kind of what he wanted to build this contrast between him and the president.
Right, and also to kind of project strength. I mean, I thought he did that very effectively by. Where Bachmann arranged her evening very effectively, to avoid having to be in the same room as Perry. Perry very deliberately sat through her speech, a couple feet away. She didn't acknowledge him. And I think, some way, he's proved by being there with Obama, he's trying to do the same thing that Romney is trying to do, which is to say, I can go up against this guy. Yeah.
Now, the other interesting thing about the Perry phenomenon is that there seems to be increasing buzz that he's not going to be the last new entrant into the race.
Karl Rove said today that
Karl Rove appeared on Fox, I guess last night or this morning actually, that and talked about the possibility of Christie, of Paul Ryan, of possibility of Palin. Who knows? Maybe somebody else. Giuliani is still out there. Actually entering this race, and the conventional wisdom, I guess the first deadline to file is in November, but even the strictest conventional wisdom has it possible, to enter at least till mid-September. I mean, people have got almost a month to get in. Do you think you're going to see anybody else in?
I had thought that Perry getting in and sort of his launch, kind of clearing the mountain, was going to send the signal like, okay, that slot is taken. But I do think instead it sort of sent the signal, come on in, the water's fine. But people also have different motives to float, to float the possibility of new. I don't know. What do you think? Is this real, or is this just like the latest of this worn out chatter?
It's certainly not real for everybody, and I don't, I don't see how Chris Christie, who almost threatened suicide instead of running. I mean, when you say, I'd rather commit suicide than run for president, you're making a fairly strong statement. I think that could be beyond Sherman-esque, as a matter of fact.
Well, he could just pull like a do I contradict myself thing, I think.
Well, I suppose he could, but I really don't see him doing this. Giuliani, I do see it's entirely possible that he'll enter the race. The interesting thing about Giuliani is he's never on anybody's lips. On the other hand, in national polling among Republican voters, he still does pretty well. And I suppose maybe he thinks that this time he could use some of his polling prominence and this time not run the world's worst campaign that he did last time. Palin, I continue to believe that she's not. And the newest name to talk about is Paul Ryan, who did say some provocative things after the debate Thursday night, when he was basically asked, "Are you happy with the field?" And he said, "Not what I saw tonight." So that's
and who stayed off the super committee.
And he stayed off the super committee, which may have been. I mean, there are non-presidential reasons for all of these things that he's doing.
Yes.
And there are also presidential reasons for all of these things he's doing.
But you know,
so,
like the Weekly Standard, which is quite close to him, reported that he's thinking about it, and I mean,
right.
That obviously comes right from him. Like that's not, I would think, right? I mean, that's not coming.
Yes.
It's not coming from. It's. I assume that Steve Hayes' sources are very good. So.
I would assume this is correct, that he is indeed thinking about this, or maybe that he's virtually decided on doing it. So,
this went from being the most boring campaign ever to being an incredibly fun campaign to cover very fast. Yeah,
it has turned into a very, very, very quickly into a real campaign. As far as Palin's concerned, it's interesting. Do you think she's going to do anything?
Yes. But I couldn't tell you why. I spent an hour following her around the other day.
Mm-hmm.
And the most striking thing to me, aside from the incredible, physical condition she's in, she must have been, climbing rocks in Alaska all summer, because she was out in the hot sun, and reporters were just kind of dropping like flies around her as she sort of stood there and answering questions, and what had been this immense press pack gradually dwindled to just sort of a handful of us, kind of hobbling through this dirty, this kind of dirt driveway up to where she was going to go have lunch. And people are asking her questions, and at some point, it'd been 80 minutes, and she was giving basically very banal answers to all these questions. And at some point, we all kind of just ran out of the few stragglers ran out of questions.
Mm-hmm.
And she looks up, almost sort of startled that there's nobody there to ask her questions, and it's a very strange moment. And finally,
now that is,
which made me just think she likes that she had come to the state fair to see the national media, basically, and the best way to keep that going is to run for president.
Could be. It is a huge contrast, by the way, to Bachmann. I mean, Palin just standing around saying, "Anybody got anything else? Any other questions?"
Yeah.
She's really made herself somewhat available during the East Coast tour, but much more in Iowa. And she also, I saw her as well at the fair, I guess this was Friday, right? Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Friday. She also did a lot of just walking around and, kind of collecting a crowd that walked with her and signing autographs and everything. So I don't know. I will say the Fox News tea leaves, I think, are important in this. And even though I'm a Fox News contributor, I have zero knowledge
mm-hmm.
about this. But she's still there. And
she's still there, but she repeatedly went out of her way it was really noticeable to me as I was on my way over, sort of hustling over to see her by the Big Boar, which is where she was stationed at the fair.
Mm-hmm.
It's called that. I passed a Fox News crew, which was just really irritated, I think, basically not to be given a heads up by their colleague where she was going to be.
Right.
And she then went on to, I think, 2 or 3 times praise Newt Gingrich for calling out the press at the debate. And by
mm-hmm.
the press,
mm-hmm.
he meant your colleague Britt Hume, or your co-moderator.
Chris Wallace, I think.
Chris Wallace.
Mm-hmm.
And it just seemed sort of, she's not, the rogue thing with her is real. She was not the world's best employee of the McCain campaign. I don't think she's going to win Employee of the Month at Fox either.
Well, here again, I can't speak to any of this other than to say that she's still there. And they did force Gingrich out and Santorum out, and they made Huckabee decide. So mm-hmm. I don't know what's going on there, but I continue to think that she's not going to run here. But who knows?
I just wouldn't rule out that she surprises the Fox.
I'm sorry, what?
It wouldn't utterly shock me, given the way she was talking about Fox in the last few days, that she would take Fox by surprise.
Well, that could be as well. So I don't know, but
yeah. So the debate.
The debate, yes.
You had a front row seat. And I guess
did.
before I ask you about the really interesting column you wrote the other day, I just wonder, what you saw that we didn't, or if you left with different impressions than the people who then you read about who were watching it on TV.
Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I mean, it was obviously very interesting to see it that close, to see the candidates that close, even to watch them sort of mill around. People don't see in the commercial breaks, the candidates just do not stand frozen behind their podiums. They get up and walk around the stage and come over and say hi and make the smallest of small talk. So it was interesting, and some of my impressions were significantly different from people at home. Chris was sitting right next to me, and Gingrich was over on our side of the stage. So I was watching as he questioned Gingrich, and my thought was, Gingrich is really too hot. I mean, he's just too hot for the occasion. And so after the debate, when I'm talking to members of the audience who are all, Republican activists or people active in Republican politics from around Iowa, and there was a lot of pro-Gingrich sentiment. And then since then, we've heard even more of it. There are some people who just say Gingrich won the debate. But in any event, they liked what he was saying. So
I liked how you and Fox sort of stood in for the hated MSM. You played them on TV. You played us on TV.
Well, I wouldn't say that we played any role other than asking serious questions. And
no, actually, and I thought the questions were good. I'm not trying to criticize the debate. I just thought for the audience, you guys got some boos that were probably not intended for Byron and Fox News.
There's no doubt that we did get some boos, but I think the one thing that there was an enormous amount of planning goes into one of these things. They don't just happen. And so we'd had weeks of meetings, and that's just on the panel side. I mean, there were millions of other meetings for the technical folks and all sorts of other things. But, we started out with the idea that everybody in the audience knows that all of the candidates think Barack Obama is doing a bad job, and they think he should be replaced next year. So that's the given, and the question is, what can we do to reveal more of the candidates themselves to the Republican audience and the rest of the audience as well? And what can we do to reveal the differences between the candidates, or get them to reveal the differences between each other? So that was the idea, and I thought it went pretty well, and so I was pretty happy with the result. But we knew that the questions that we asked were going to make the candidates themselves, uncomfortable most of the time, and that's what happened.
Probably the most discomforting one came when you asked Michelle Bachmann what she meant when she had said that she would be a submissive wife.
Right.
And I guess, and I think, and which drew a round of boos for you,
yes.
Which must be discomforting in its own way. And you then wrote a column about a couple days later that how can you defend yourself, Mr. York?
How can you defend yourself? This was a question that had been thought about for a long time. I wrote it, but all of the questions had been gone over for weeks ahead of time. I mean, some of them were written the day before, but some of them had been written for 2 or 3 weeks, and during that process, they had been read aloud to the group and tweaked and critiqued and thrown out, and new ones formed, and all of that over a period of a number of weeks. And this one in particular had been written for, I don't know, at least 2 weeks. And it came from a video that you can watch on YouTube, which is an appearance by Bachmann when she made her first run for Congress, successful as it turned out, in 2006 at a church in her district. And she was sort of telling the story of her life and the role that God played in calling her to do various things in her life, how she met her husband, how she went to law school at Oral Roberts University, and then she got to the part about going to law school to get another degree in tax law. And that's where she said her husband told her that she needed to go get a second degree in tax law. And she said, I hate taxes, I don't want to do this. But then she quoted a verse from Ephesians saying, wives, you are to be submissive to your husband. I didn't mention the part in the same tape where she said that she was submissive because she believed God was calling her through her husband. So I thought that the fact that she said this in 2006, in public, on stage, microphone in hand, in the context of a political campaign, I thought that made that a legitimate question to ask. And clearly the people in the room didn't like it. And I was on Laura Ingram's show the morning after the debate, and she said, "Oh, we heard the audience groaning in the background." And I said, "Laura, they were not groaning. They were booing." But I think it stood up as kind of an interesting answer. It was the most human moment of the night for her. If you listen to her voice is different from the voice she had when she was, exchanging blows with Tim Pawlenty or answering questions about the debt limit. And I personally thought it was a good answer. Now, subsequently, I know she was asked on Meet the Press and Face the Nation about it on Sunday. And she gave basically the same answer, and those answers were not really accepted. Her answer being that to her and her husband, submission means respect, and some people aren't buying it.
It's a good answer, but it's not what it says in Ephesians, right?
No, it's not. No, I mean, first of all, they can interpret it any way they want. If they want to have their own private interpretation, they can.
But it struck me that was not what she was communicating to that crowd in 2006.
There are two different words. Obviously, the word submit is used a lot in the Bible, and it means usually submitting to an authority of some sort. And love, in the next verse where husbands are admonished to love their wives as Christ loved the church, that's a different word. So, there have been all sorts of theological arguments about it. But she's decided to make this case, and I think she'll be sticking to it. I do think it means that she'll be asked about it some more. I erroneously thought afterwards, after all the reaction, I thought, well, she's not going to get asked that question again. And she did, and continues to be. So I was wrong about that.
I mean, I think she has, this is a problem not of her doing at all, just that things that, elements of her story that are not, front and center in the political debate right now, and not particularly what she wants to talk about, but particularly her past stances on gay rights and how she conducts her marriage, are things that make interesting television and interesting stories, and people are interested in talking about in sort of a cultural context.
Yeah.
And so it's a bit harder for her to get away from that stuff than in a certain sort of rational way it might be.
And that's because she has spoken about it at some length in the past.
Oh, it's a huge part of her career. Yeah, exactly. No, it's been at times a very big part of her career. She doesn't particularly want it to be right now, but it's not fully up to her.
So even though it hasn't been a really long political career, she's only been in Congress for 6 years, and she was a state senator before that. She has made all these statements. So I mean, it's fine. She can handle it. But there are going to be questions, and I was the one. I drew the social issues, so I was the one who asked the various questions about Mormonism and Islam and gay marriage and just abortion and other stuff. So that was my little bailiwick there. So it fell to me to ask the question.
It was interesting to watch. And actually, I thought particularly Herman Cain, who really is not a typical politician in the sense that he never, he never was given the memo. Don't answer the Mormon question.
That's true.
It was interesting on the.
But that was kind of charming, wasn't it? I mean, wasn't that appealing when he actually answered the question?
I'm sure Mitt Romney found it thoroughly charming.
Yeah, less than charming.
Palin was asked the same question.
But what I was,
Bachmann,
I'm sorry, what I was referring to, saying that the charming part was that Herman Cain said, "Well, yes, I did say that." And
yeah, exactly. He didn't.
So actually, what I meant.
And this is why I said it. This is where I got it, and I thought about it more. Yeah, no, he was actually.
Yeah,
it was
so
an honest answer.
It was appealing that he would actually just come out and answer the question, which more polished politicians just don't do. But you were going to say something about Palin.
Yeah, she was asked she said, Michelle Bachmann said submission means respect, and she's they're often compared. They are such different characters. She's out there with Todd, getting mobbed by the press and supporters, and laughs and says, and kind of starts to say, well, that's her answer. She said it from her heart. That's a good answer, and thinks about it a little more and says, well, I mean, submissive. I mean, I don't. Just kind of starts laughing and looks at Todd's, and I don't think he tells me anything. It was a funny moment.
Mm-hmm.
She's a much less sort of formal character.
Well, that is one feature of these campaigns, that one candidate says something and the press immediately runs to another candidate, in this case the other woman, and a non-candidate, and immediately poses the test to them, too. All right, so have we covered it? Have we covered the entire political landscape?
The entire waterfront? I think we may have, Byron.
Have we? I'm not sure we really totally got an answer about your being able to get your mind about Rick Perry's manliness. Maybe you'll write something about that in the future, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, Chris Matthews has lent me the tingles that were going down his leg for Obama.
And that's what's happening with you.
As Ann Althouse noted, eating that hard-boiled egg on a stick was really quite a moment.
It was the hard-boiled part.
I think seriously. I think like there's just the story to be written about Perry is a lot about his kind of high testosterone Texan self-presentation, which is, I mean, whether it's his personality or it's his shtick is just a lot of what's going to be, what voters are going to kind of perceive about him and kind of decide whether they like or not. I mean, he really is this sort of, he feels like he comes from the same place as Bush, only more so. I mean, he does. And we were after the Waterloo speech, we were talking to folks. These are Republican activists for whom saying somebody's like George W. Bush is certainly not an insult, and in fact, in this case, was definitely a compliment. But this nice couple, Donald Pohl and his wife, Ponnell and his wife, said to me, we met Bush because everybody in Iowa has met everyone, and he was, and the way in which Perry had kind of come over and put his arm on this guy's shoulder and looked into his eyes and really kind of connected with him in a very natural way, like reminded him a lot of Bush. And I think that'll be something. That'll be certainly part of what Perry reckons with. And I think like how ready. I don't know. The pundits say various things on whether people want somebody who kind of seems superficially a lot like Bush and another Texan governor. I think we'll just have to see whether that's an issue or not.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I think he's going to turn out to be not everybody's cup of tea. I know that I had gotten reports from, Perry's been pretty active in the last month, going around talking to people, talking to big donors. Anytime there's a gathering of sort of influential Republicans, he would be there kind of testing things. And it was clear from the reports I had gotten that, some of them thought he was great and some of them weren't all that impressed. So, I don't think he's going to run away with this thing. I think the reason he's in is because Romney remains weak and there's a certain brittleness about Romney's lead and maybe even his entire persona on the campaign trail that there certainly isn't about Perry. So, I can see why he got in, but the idea that he immediately comes in and becomes the front runner is, to me, probably not going to be the case.
And it's also notable that he's not used to. I think he just hasn't been in a situation where people are listening all that closely to what he says.
Right.
He's in his. He's been governor a long time. The Texas media has heard it all before. They're used to it. It's not news to them. And like last night, his last event of the day, it's quite late. He sort of doesn't want to answer this question about Bernanke. He thinks better of it, and then says something a little off the rails. And
yeah.
And earlier in the day, he had repeated basically an urban legend or a rural legend about some federal regulation on tractors that wouldn't let them cross the street. And he also, during that speech earlier in the day, had gotten wrong the name of a Navy SEAL an Iowa Navy SEAL who was being buried that week, the next day. And I guess I just wonder. I don't know. Like, can he be careful, or is he going to sort of if the coverage of him is a gaffe a day, his central message isn't going to get out. It's not like people really do know who he is.
Well, so far, I will say that, again, before he got in, I don't think his team thought about that a lot. I specifically talked to him about it, and their position was he'd been elected statewide in Texas, I can't remember how many times, but a number of times.
Like 10.
And against, Democrats who were non-pushovers, so they felt that he had been thoroughly vetted by that. And I think that's an error to think that way, because national scrutiny is different from state scrutiny in any
stuff
event.
that was stuff that is old news in Texas will be new news.
Exactly. So anything, it's like, and I'm not saying he's got this, but remember with Huckabee and the guy he had pardoned, I think his name was Wayne Dumond, who went out, who he'd set free and went on to commit murder. And then there was another case as well. So Huckabee, all of the debates that had gone on inside Arkansas about Huckabee's clemency policies became a national issue, which would have gotten much bigger had Huckabee, continued and,
It's
either made a big deal in that way.
I don't think Perry is going to have a clemency problem.
No, I don't think he. Well, I mean, obviously, for Democrats who have a lack of clemency problem, but I'm not suggesting it's clemency. It's just an issue from your past in the state that comes back to get you.
I mean, I wonder. There was this very detailed David Grann article a year or two ago, making the case that Perry had approved the execution of a guy who he had pretty good reason to think might be innocent.
Right.
I don't know the case really beyond the article, but it was a pretty convincing article. And I wonder, do you think that is something that becomes an issue in a Republican primary, or do you think it's sort of not on the radar?
I do not see that becoming an issue in the Republican primary. If he became the nominee, sure, it'd be out there, and I'm sure several other cases that that he had signed off on that maybe they weren't at all clear cut, but that Democratic activists would want to make a big deal of. I'm sure they would pop up again. I don't see that as being an issue in the Republican race. I mean, just look at it. Just look at the states. I just don't see it happening there.
No, I know there was some line from a focus group that one of his hapless opponents had conducted where they tried to use this line against him, and with the response had been that it takes balls to execute an innocent man. I don't know.
All right.
Which is perhaps an overstatement. In any event, good talking to you, Byron.
Good to talk to you, and let's do it again sometime.
Yep, signing off now.
See ya. Bye.